photograph, he'd see her for the first time since she'd chased him out of her house, tears streaming down her cheeks, while slinging toward him whatever items she could get her hands on. 2. Trey turned into the Saddle Trails subdivision, then slowed down as he prepared to meet up with Zoe. He'd left the office early so he could run by his place, iron his shirt, put on some aftershave, and rustle up something he could use for a backbone. Though she wasn't the first girl he'd been with, she was the first girl he'd ever loved. The only girl he'd ever loved, if he were honest with himself. In elementary school, she'd been a buck-toothed kid with wavy brown hair that stuck out like a stick figure drawing. The 3 years between them had seemed like decades. He'd not given her more than a passing glance back then. Hadn't even been in the same school with her since he'd entered junior high. At least, not until that year she'd started high school. And something magical had happened to her while he wasn't looking. All of a sudden, her teeth were straight, her hair tamed, her manner guileless, and her figure, well, her figure had been something else. The difference in their ages ceased to be important. No matter that he was a senior and she a freshman, she'd tangled his insides like no other girl had before or since. They'd been together for 7 months, though before she'd ever allowed him to put so much as a toe inside her house, and what he'd discovered had horrified him. Her entire house, floor to ceiling, was filled with junk. Vintage junk from eras gone by. The house wasn't in squalor or filth exactly. There'd been no dead animals or mice lurking under piles. It was sanitary for the most part, if you discounted the dust. No, it was the sheer magnitude of items that had dumbfounded him. Her father had evidently gone kinda wonky when his mother passed, and he'd inherited all her stuff. According to Zoe, he'd refused to part with any of it, not even Grandma's fingernail clippers. Then he'd started going to garage sales and estate sales, bought up everything he could find from his mother's era. Magazines, newspapers, old radio cases, vintage vacuum cleaners, tablecloths, aprons, trays, music boxes, more silverware than a body could ever use, and all kinds of other junk. It had been going on for years, so by the time Trey was invited in, the family had made paths just to navigate from one room to the next. Even Zoe's room had been used to store her father's overflow. After the initial shock had worn off, anger set in. What kind of father subjected his wife and daughters to that kind of crap? Never in his young life had Trey been exposed to anything like that. His family home was warm, clean, suffused with light, and full of laughter. This home of Zoe's, however, was dark, oppressive, and unhealthy. He in no way, shape, or form wanted this woman subjected to that sort of abuse. At the time, he'd been young, stupid, and thinking he could strut sitting down. As a result, instead of showing compassion, he'd indulged in self-righteous anger. Insisted she must confront her father. She'd refused, of course, and he'd been too immature to appreciate the complexity of the situation. So, idiot that he was, he decided he'd confront her dad himself. This pronouncement had caused her such extreme anxiety that he'd backed down, but he was none too happy about it. The dissension over it began to corrode their relationship, which only made him angrier and more sanctimonious. When the two of them were alone, he took every opportunity to diss her dad, ridicule him, malign him. He'd called the old goat every name he could think of, but nothing propelled her to take action. In all that time, though, Trey had never told anyone, not even his dad, had guarded her secret as painstakingly as she had. He wondered now if it was because he'd felt shame by association. Whatever the reason, he'd finally had enough. In an effort to end it once and for all, to prove he was right and her dad was a freak,